Well, Anita, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it has been an amazing conference so far. The symposium is really, really informative. So our goal is, so Texture Technologies formed 30 years ago, and all we do is measure texture. We don't do moisture, we don't do color, all we do is texture and texture measurement. And our specialty is understanding what people want to know about their products, then helping them determine what a good method is to do that, and then turn around and implement the methods so that they can make the right decisions based on the textural objectives that they're looking for. And that whole process is very, very special for the Cultured Meat Symposium and the Cultured Meat audience in particular, because all these startups are absolutely amazing. They have such great scientists, such great hopes. So the driving aspirations behind the entire industry is really amazing, and we want to help them succeed. But they don't always know what they need to know yet, and that's where this symposium presentation comes in. Thank you. So my job today is to walk through what sensory objectives can be measured, and then sort of walk that through by different form factors. And then once we go over those form factors and understand what it is that can be measured, walk through actual examples on how to measure it. So this industry, unlike the confectionery industry where someone might say, I want to start off with a candy bar, and they just build a whole industry around a candy bar, this industry is running in 1,000 different directions. Right? So people are coming in and saying they want to develop something that will replace shrimp. They want to develop things that will replace sheep or hamburgers or patties or crumble. Sometimes it's just driven to control the land use, water use, ethical concerns. But we have to bring it all back when it comes to sensory management. What does the customer want? What are the customers buying? In the end, you'll only be successful if the products that you make are successfully delivered and accepted by customers. So that whole sensory science side is something not on the typical startup staff, right? You guys, so, and that's where we come in to help. So to give it some structure, I'm going to just change my my layout a little bit and zoom in. But first, let me give you an overview. Right out here are a set of probes and fixtures that are typically used to test a product, to destroy product, to stress it, depending on what you want to know. This is the Texture Analyzer TXT Plus model that I'll be using. I have lined up a whole set of different products that are all cooked, ready to go. They may not have been cooked in the last 10 minutes, so their behavior is not exactly as it would be fresh on the plate. But we do have the products ready to go to run through the test. That said, and then I have the software to control it, and we'll, in a very short section of the time, we'll be going over that as well. So let me just change my camera a little bit to zoom in on this panel, because in this industry, form factor is important. You know, are you developing a product that will be like a shrimp and will be accepted as a shrimp, or something that is supposed to be delivered in muscle meat form, or in a ahi, in a real tuna form. So you need to know what the form factor is and what you're going for. So there are some obvious ones. I mean, we heard in the presentation today how hamburgers are where people started the industry, and a very interesting presentation mid-afternoon. But they started at hamburgers. In this case, it's a patty configuration. And patties can be, of course, cooked on a grill. So the patty has to survive going out to the grill, flipping on the grill and being returned, or on a skillet. You, of course, have crumble. You have meatballs or other formed product that are in that meat form. There are nuggets, reformulated, breaded. You have a whole set of reformulated and blends of materials. You have certainly whole muscle. You've seen people talking about how to develop whole muscle, and all the scaffolding is designed to give you an emulation of the whole muscle behavior. the tensile strengths of the meat, of the muscle structure. Then you have processed materials that are sausages. So of course it has the meat component, but it has lots of other components. It has casing. Sometimes they're delivered completely in sauces, sometimes delivered outside. You have seafood. You know, if someone's buying a shrimp, they want to see a shrimp. If someone's buying an octopus, they might want to see the tentacle. They may, so if it's a scallop, a little bit less so. But seafood is definitely one of the things that will be very big, particularly if the industry breaks through in Asia early. You're going to have a much larger seafood component to the diet. Of course, you know, we've seen some people break through with some plant-based bacons, and I expect bacon material will be quick to follow. I have gel here because a lot of this material starts as a gel, as a paste in agar, but before it's extruded, you know, you have this gel structure, and a lot of people are going to be struggling to understand the behavior at the early stage. And once they understand the behavior at the early stage, they're going to wonder whether or not that correlates to the behavior as a patty or behavior as a whole muscle once it's been reformulated. And then there are some animal-specific things. I'm really excited to hear what Vow is going to do in Australia. I mean, they're starting with kangaroo meat. I have no idea what kangaroo meat is supposed to behave like, but I suspect people that do know how it should behave, and there will be some very specific geometries involved. I know that I've had warthog in South Africa, and you know, it's more, the presentation was more of a shredded piece, so there's going to be some very animal-specific form factors. Once you know the form factor, then you have to figure out what attributes are people looking to measure about it. The obvious one is firmness and toughness. Right? Is it tough? Is it chewy? Does it take a lot of effort to break? Does it fall apart? And there are lots of different ways to measure firmness, and I'll get into that on a slightly different slide. Stiffness is, oddly enough, it's one of the most important parameters that consumers rate very highly. And it's also something that is conjectured to be for evolutionary purposes. So imagine biting a rod of marble. How come you don't break your teeth? Because you know before your teeth close too much, your brain says, safety, 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 stop moving your jaw. And as a result, the brain is very fast to measure how, with the rate at which forces are climbing and understand whether or not it's safe. It ends up that stiffness is really, really well, it's a very high consumer attribute. It's very well quantified. Consumers are sometimes much better at measuring stiffness than they are at toughness and firmness. There's some interesting work by Zeta Vickers from University of Minnesota that goes into that a little bit. Crispness, you'll see that on breaded products and more on the snack side. Some of because animal discussion, some of the shapes for animals, animals like things that break, you know, build up and break. They tend to eat out of those bowls of samples rather than something else. So they tend to also pick up crispness. Crunchiness is uniquely human. It's resistance failure, resistance failure, resistance failure. You won't see that a lot in the meat side of new foods. You will certainly see it a lot in alternative proteins that are in other form factors, and especially snacks. Rubbery, resilient, and elastic. In this case, this elasticity is not the material science approach of elasticity of stretching a modulus of elasticity, which it could be, but that would be a little bit more measured as stiffness. This is more, you know, how many times you have to chew it to make it palatable to swallow. And each different class of meat has a different expectation. If I eat tuna, ahi tuna or a nice sashimi, I do not expect it to chew very much. I expect it to 1 or 2 bites, very tender, cut almost buttery, slide through it, and then have it palatable to swallow. On the other hand, if I'm looking at, something like calamari or octopus, that chew and rubbery feeling, or maybe some pork, it's actually part of the experience. But that's something that can be measured. Tensile and tug strength, very important, particularly when it comes to more processing. Imagine a patty that just falls apart, has no internal cohesive strength. So cohesive strength, tug strength, and tensile strength all sort of work together. Some things can get very stringy. From a production side, some things can be very, very sticky. Imagine trying to handle a patty, but it sticks too much, and it's just a pain in the neck to handle to get it onto the grill or to put it onto a skillet. Sticky, stringy, and adhesive behaviors can be very high profile on a production basis. To a lesser extent, when you actually eat something, is it really sticky? So these are the form factors that the industry's trying to deliver to, and everybody is sort of aiming at 1, 2, or 3 of these with the protein type that they're delivering. Is it scaffolding? What kind of scaffolding, and so on. But these attributes are important to know because some products have different. Firmness might be important for a patty, but crispness might be important for a breaded nugget. Let me jump a little bit ahead and go to how to measure things, right? So, and now I'm going to change back and forth to the other camera. So I can see that slide. I think you might be able to see it a little bit off to the side. But the first one is firmness. So what does firmness mean, right? So in classic food approaches, firmness was always done by compression, right? So you take a cylinder probe and you just compress something. How much force does it take? When it comes to meats, you tend to cut things. And the Meat Animal Research Center in Nebraska, they've developed some very strong protocols on doing a one backsword blade. The behavior is a shear. And it just, kind of like a guillotine. It is a knife. There's some unique geometry that happens with the V shape that concentrates and really works well for muscle tissue and other fibers. But toughness can also mean how things cut conventionally. I have a razor blade here, and one of the things I'll be doing is I'll be cutting into some patties. And you'll see just that shear behavior. That's a lot like your incisor teeth cutting something. When it comes to the molars, which is compression, how chewing things up, a lot of resistance, gives you a lot of firmness. You can do it with the cylinder probe again, or you can have the types of probes that are actually shaped a lot like your molar. And what that does is it captures the meat, it doesn't let it expand, and as the meat is stressed there, all the collagen, all the meat structure, all the tissue is all sort of broken all together, all the binding comes in. So this picks up the bindings a lot more than, say, just a normal conventional firmness measurement. So shearing, you can also have puncture. So a puncture probe, a classic puncture probe will come down and just break through. Very classic way of measuring firmness. So there are lots of ways of measuring firmness. Toughness tends to be the whole area of work. The brain isn't that good at picking up a peak force, but the brain is very good at understanding how much work it took to consume something or to break it up so it's palatable to swallow. So toughness is easier from the consumer side, but most people want to know how firm it is because firmness tends to be a little bit lower standard deviation and better able to use as a qualifying determinant to see, is this formula a little bit more firm than another formula? Stiffness tends to be slope. So when you have enough, I think you can still see this. So this initial slope is how stiff something is. The steeper that is, the more the force is climbing. And that can be measured force over time or force over distance. The instruments don't matter. The point is it's just the rate at which force is building. That's typically stiffness. Crispness tends to be the same behavior, but once you have a failure, something has to break. A piece of glass that's just climbing as you break it won't be crisp until it actually breaks. And crispness tends to be breaded products in this sub-industry. You might have crispness sometimes on a evaluation of a casing, like a sausage casing or a hot dog casing, but it would be an unusual use of the word crispness. Most people think of crispness as snack oriented. Crunchiness is resistance failure, resistance failure. Typically when you come down, you can compress things and you stress out a bunch of cells, they break, you stress some more, the next ones break. And so you end up with this resistant failure behavior that can be quantified. Rubbery and resilience tend to be how things push back. So you push down on something, does it fight to regain its shape? Or if you pull away, does it slowly recover its shape in its own way? It can be very differentiating. Something related to that, which is this industry is going to be dealing with early on, is how well things lose their shape under little or no gravity. So imagine putting some paste or putting some gel down and having it slump. That would be a relaxation. So the force would climb up, you'd stop, and then does the force stay straight like it would a spring or something like a piece of pork? Or does it lose its shape and slowly just degrade when nothing's happening? That relaxation behavior would be slump. And on the gel side, people are going to be dealing with that. Cohesion is, I think, where people are going to be really struggling in this industry. Primarily because you're trying to create a matrix where the muscle tissue and all the different types of tissues are sort of binding themselves together. And just how well do they hold on to part? So we have 5 or 6 ways of measuring cohesion. So you could just measure cohesion coming down, compressing, coming back up, coming down again. If the material was very cohesive and held together, didn't get destroyed or go past the point of plastic deformation on the first stroke, then the second stroke will have a very similar profile as the first, and it won't break down as much. That's a very simplistic form of cohesion. In this industry, it's much more, I'll say, brutal. Let me give you an example. I apologize for this. So I have a tug fixture. It's an interlocking tug fixture. It's a bunch of pins. I'm just going to impale it. So from your perspective, you can see from the back, I've got these interlocking pins. From the front, you can barely see the pins coming throughout. There's a whole way of processing it and mounting it. But as I pull apart, I am causing a little tug of war to happen with the material, really stressing it out and stressing the binder over a large area. When you're dealing with very small amounts of materials, Petri dish scale, you might bring that whole test down to something that's really, really small. I don't know if you can see that, but that's really small area where you can create a very micro tug of war. This would be a more conventional tug of war. This is a tug fixture we've been using for many, many years. I can just impale a chicken nugget and pull it apart and tear it apart. It will give me a very good sense of the resistance. And as you have different binders, different formulations, different degrees of cure, different degrees of cook, you'll have very different tug behaviors. Okay. Now, this industry is going to have some complex issues because I'm going to work backwards. You don't know yet how your product is going to be consumed, right? And so you don't necessarily have control of the provenance. So imagine, you now see Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, they're in lots of different places. It's amazing. It's really wonderful to see. But if they were just in high-end restaurants, they could control the whole experience. They could say, only put this product on a nice piece of bread, only put it with some fresh lettuce, only put it with some nice crisp tomato, and use a little bit of sauce, but not too much sauce. They could really control the experience. And some venues let you do that quite well, and some don't. So, if you're more sushi, oriented, you probably have a little bit more control over the provenance of how people are going to be enjoying your product. On the other hand, you cook it at home and someone just gets a phone call and happens to overcook the product by a few minutes. Does the product turn to dust? Does it turn to rubber? How does it behave? Pretty critical. So when this industry starts delivering a consumable product, the measurements that you're doing, the texture measurements, the adhesive measurements, the toughness, the tug, cohesion, all those measurements get more complicated because the experience of the consumer changes. So you're going to look at shelf life issues that will change over time. How this stuff behaves in your lab, how does it behave after 2 months? How does it behave after 6 months? You're going to look at fresh delivery versus freeze thaw. Once it leaves frozen from your dock, you may not control whether or not it really experiences freeze thaw well enough. You're going to have some standards, but you may not have a lot of control over it. Grilling, cooking, and handling. Just how aggressively does someone treat the burger when it's on the grill? Does it fall apart? You give someone a burger and they end up having pieces of a patty. That's not going to go over well. So it's going to have to survive in that whole process. I mentioned the delivery. One of my favorite parts, and you normally see this in the conventional food industry, and you're just now starting to experience it in the alternative protein industry, is how a product behaves over time. And by time, I mean very, very narrow. So we have all eaten French fries before we've even paid for them. At this, they're still sort of adding up the bill. We're eating the French fries. So we're consuming that product within moments after being finished. We expect the product to be good at that time. If we're 10 miles down the highway and those French fries are soggy, we don't blame the store anymore. We blame ourselves for not eating it quickly. Likewise, if you ordered a pizza and the pizza was very decent in the first 10 minutes, but then turned to rock or cardboard, but someone didn't deliver the pizza for 15 minutes, you'd only get the cardboard. So even though the pizza might have been absolutely perfect when it came out of the oven. So you want to know, and part of your testing protocol is to understand just how stable you are. I'm more than happy to share this. Anybody, Alex, I have an application study that goes over a little bit more detail. But the concept here is you have upper and lower control limits as to, your product is good within a certain range. And when it comes out of the oven or comes out of whatever process that it's being cooked, you want it to be within the good range for the whole duration of time that someone might consume that product. If they consume it quickly, French fries before you've paid it, better be good. If they consume it after 45 minutes, if that's expected behavior, it better be good there. Afterwards, you don't care if it gets too hard over time or gets too soupy and mushy over time, but during the target time, whatever it is that this product is going to be consumed, you want the product to have the attributes, the textural attributes that you've dialed in on the previous discussion. Okay. And with that, I am now going to swap over to actually do some tests. So I'm going to take my camera here and just sort of swing it around a little bit. And I'm going to zoom in on product. Let's see if I can line this up. Apologize for those of you watching at home. So I have a conventional burger. I have a Moore's blade. This Moore's blade is a razor blade that's just attached to a holder. I'm going to shear it, and I'm going to be going through whatever. This is a natural hamburger. I do have an alternative hamburger, but I think this method will work just fine. I'm going to program the instrument to come down, find the surface of the burger, and then go 90% through the burger. So I'm now going to jump and share my screen. So let's jump over to do this. So hopefully at this point you have a screen share, and in the gallery you might be able to see the close-up view. I have this as a traditional burger. I'm just going to, it's actually with a Moore's blade. A Moore's blade, and I'm just going to run a test. Start test. So the blade's going to come down, encounter the surface, go down, and cut through. I'm just going to rotate this and just do a bunch of tests. Mind you, this has been sitting out now for a while, so this feels exactly like a hamburger that's been sitting out for an hour after it was cooked. I'm not worried about variability at this point. I just wanted to show you the types of results that would be there. I'm just going to zoom in on just these. Yeah, so let's see, view selected only. Okay, so the force, you see that it's climbing up to about 400 or 500 grams of force. That's about a half a kilo, about a pound. Breaks through on some of them, and then it comes through, and because it's cutting all the way to the bottom, it's hitting voids, coming through and hitting tissue along the way. I'm just going to run another test. So pretty conventional shear. What's nice about this type of blade is if you can control the geometry and the presentation, you can do lots of replicates pretty easily, right? Because it's a small cutting area. The geometry that's being cut is just the 11 or 12 millimeters of the width of that blade. It is a relatively sharp blade, and it's designed to be replaceable so that you can replace it. Okay. So that's pretty conventional cutting behavior. Let's go to something Monty Python-esque and do something completely different. Let's test. We'll test some patties. Test this with a when you get old, your eyes go, so it takes a little bit of. So this is just a conventional breaded patty, nothing fancy. Let me just turn all of these off and start a new graph. Sorry, the zoom controls are in the way, so I just need to move them. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment just so I can get to my screen. And now I'll share again. Sorry, the way the zoom sets the controls, they hide my bar here. So let me just go to my settings. I am just going to tell it, just go with 5 millimeters into it. I think I have 5 millimeters of travel there. coming down, find the surface, going 5 millimeters and coming out, right? So hardly tested at all. So let's change that distance to go a little bit deeper. Much better cutting, really highlighted the crumb a little bit more, or the crust rather. So anytime you use a blade of this nature, you want to control the geometry of the product, because a wider product has more product to be tested, and so you're going to have slightly higher results. But all those are conventional shearing tests. Alex, if you can interrupt it, if people ask any question along the way, I'm happy to change my configuration to test anything. So absolutely happy to change it, but just let me know what questions people may have, and I'll go ahead and change it accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have any questions, definitely put them in the chat. I think we're all just a little bit mesmerized at how interesting this entire process is. My curiosity in this example specifically, what if you were to run the test at, let's say, 5 or 10 millimeters, but then run the same test again without moving it? Maybe that's not beneficial. Maybe you would be able to get some other insights. Can you give us any details about that?
Yeah, so the reason you wouldn't do that is when you eat something, you don't partially bite it and then bite it again in that same spot and then bite it again in that same spot. That's not how you would experience the product. So you probably wouldn't design a test to fatigue and stress that in the same spot. Now, if you do fatigue the same spot again and again and again, classic cyclic fatigue, you are learning a little bit about the binding, and from an academic perspective, you're learning about the product. But it's not imitative, and it's not mimicking what a consumer would do. Even when a consumer happens to bite into the same piece, imagine, for example, you had a cube of tofu or a cube of pork, and you bite into that same piece, your jaw and tongue are repositioning it between bites. So not only have you introduced saliva and some other pieces when it's broken down, but you've basically reformulated it or reformed it a little bit, and you're not going identically into the same spot.
I see, that makes sense. And in terms of maybe any type of kind of, let's say, testing out some sort of scaffolding, is there, maybe this is not the test, but what would be the best test to kind of see if we are working on some sort of scaffolding that that we would be able to measure?
That's a great question. So the first thing I would ask is, what do you want to know about the scaffold? And so if it was the cohesion of the scaffolding, how well it is holding together, how well it handles stress, then I might do a tug tensile behavior on the scaffolding and give it a chance to actually be pulled apart, and pulled apart gently. So then you might actually do the cyclic behavior, right? So I'm just going to line this up. I'm just going to look at the different products I have here that might lend itself quite nicely to us. I'm going to take, this is a piece of steak, piece of strip steak, about 7 millimeters thick. I have a piece of freshly cut steak. This could be all scaffolding. I'm going to put it on the foam, and the reason I'm going to put it on the foam, on the sponge, is because I'm going to mount it because these things are sharp. So now, let's see if I'm just going to change the angle a little bit so you can see a little bit from the side here. So, Alex, can you see, is that zoomed in close enough?
I can, and maybe
I
let's
can
see.
even go closer if you want.
It looks good. I'm just worried about if people can.
Well, why don't I stop the screen sharing and then we'll
Yeah,
see.
yeah. Let's do
and
that.
then we'll try it on the full size, right? So that should help. So I just won't. I'll do it without the software then. So as I'm just going to use my up arrows to bring the instrument up and tear this thing apart. Okay. So if that was a scaffolding, it's quite possible that I might have it just cycle up and down, up and down, up and down, right? Just in that same spot. And I might do that 30 times. I could do it 300 times. I could do it 2 million times. You would probably not, when you do that type of test, you'd probably measure the first test, the second test, the third test, maybe the 10th, then maybe the 50th, then maybe the 100th, then maybe the 100,000th. And what you're looking for is whether or not this thing weakens over time and how it handles the stress. There's not likely to be a scaffolding that needs that much stress in a cyclic form. The types of stresses that would probably happen on a scaffold would probably be more time and pressure. Something under a lot of pressure, under a lot of stress. Maybe there's an extrusion process involved. And so when you're looking more, step this back just a touch. I'm just going to move this up. So I'm mixing and matching different types of probes here. I'm just getting this out of the view for the moment. But this is a case where if I was doing a scaffolding and I was fatiguing something and I wanted to slide and thin out, I might use really smooth materials and I might cycle on that up and down, up and down, up and down, of whether it's very aggressive as if you were pounding it, or just ever so slightly cycling it by fraction of a millimeter and just yo-yoing it, and maybe doing a relaxation test along the way. That would tell me whether scaffolding is likely to survive a lot of stress. If there was a musculature that I wanted to bring into play, imagine doing the exact same thing, only now with a probe. Think of it as a meat tenderizer. As you come down, you'll have lots of little stresses built into the product as you go down. The beauty of this type of behavior is that the product doesn't spread out and it concentrates the shear. It doesn't let the product fail laterally. It keeps it focused underneath the behavior. And so you could have the same thing using a fixture with an aluminum grid. And I can really jam down. You can really see the stress in the product that would happen. And you can scale this large and small.
Great. So in relation to this, we have a question from Kieran who asks, the purpose in many ways is to test kind of the bite, right? Is there any attachment that actually has like kind of teeth marks or anything like that to mimic the bite marks?
So there is, the answer is yes. I am looking here. So this particular probe, it's called an incisor blade. It's about the size of an incisor tooth. We've done them in 1s and 2s. We've actually had people give us dentures and we've mounted real teeth, but it's kind of awful from an academic perspective because it's not replicable. So you probably want to have a relatively solid stainless steel cleanable stiff material. So this is 11 millimeters wide, 1.5 millimeters thick, and it's stiff enough to be able to come down and bite. Look at the shear behavior through, and you can go relatively deep into a product. It's not that dissimilar from the Moore's blade. The Moore's blade is much sharper and designed to actually tear more aggressively. Incisor blades tend to not tear as sharply. We intentionally do not have a rounded end or chisel end on that blade. Pretty common for incisor blade.
Great. We have a couple more questions here. One of them is, or a few of them are about like industry standards. So is there like a catalog of parameters already established for the food industry, such as, for example, a good steak experience should have force of X, slope of Y? Is there something like that? And then as a follow-up, I also want to ask here, a point of clarification. When the graphs peak, is that when it goes through the product, so the force drops?
Not necessarily. Well, let me go back to the screen share. So this was cutting into the chicken patty, and here there are some peaks along the way. That's probably when we went into the breading. But pretty much it stopped climbing in force because we stopped going down. If we had kept going down, it would have been a little bit more. And that's more rubbery. If this was a more fresh product, it hadn't been sitting out in my kitchen for a while, it probably would have climbed. Oh, I don't know if that's, I don't know why the annotation is a little bit funky here. But I'm trying to draw an earlier peak right here. Yeah, it's not. Let me try again. No, the annotation tool is a little bit choppy right now, so I'm just going to ignore that. I'll draw it on the screen behind me. So let me stop the screen share. It's probably the easiest way to do it. So very defined peak. Force climbed, you broke in. At that point, you broke into the product. You broke through a shell. If I was doing something like bacon, and I was coming down, and let's do this right angle here. If I were to break bacon, the force would climb, and you'd have a single break. You might have a little crack. It might be a little bit of rocking, but pretty much you would have a single break. That would be where the structure of the material failed. So yes, in that case, if you have a behavior that allows failure, then you have that. But if you put a piece of pork behind your teeth, you may not know when the failure happens. All right, so you're really looking at the whole area of work on that. So some products have a clear failure. This tug, when I pulled apart the piece of steak, there was a clear peak force. The product had started tearing, and I had broken musculature and bonds long before the absolute peak force. So you have early failure, and then the ultimate failure when the sum of all the work had broken the most, if you will. Going back to standards, there are very, very few standards. One of in the Meat Animal Research Center, Shackelford and a bunch of others there published a lot of early work, and they end up standardizing a method but not a result. So this is how to use, for example, a Warner-Brachler shear mechanism on cutting meat. And it may not have been Warner-Brachler. They have a Meat Animal Research version of it, where you take meat from a certain provenance, do it in a certain direction, and you test it. But they don't tell you what's good and bad. They don't say 100 is good and 300 is awful and 50 is bad. Or, 50 is too soft and 300 is too hard. They don't tell you anything about what's good or bad. They just tell you this is the method, because they want people to be able to have their own identity as to whether or not products are good or bad. So the standards don't apply to that. The same thing applies. There are very few methods within the food industry. The AACC has a bunch of methods dealing with pasta and bread. And the gel industry has lots of variations of the same method, which is gel firmness. You're basically going down with a small probe into some gel, deflecting a certain amount. And there are some strict pros and cons. The reason being is that the value that the industries get shipped under are impacted by the gel. So if a gel has a 300-gram strength, it's worth more than something that has a 290-gram strength, and it's worth more than something that has a 250-gram strength. The closest you get to an industry that has standards and really good or bad is Cerini. Cerini is tested with a 5mm diameter ball probe. A very small probe, has a 5mm ball on the end, and they go into Cerini. And the Cerini looks like a 1-inch cut of hot dog. Come in from the ends, and they look at the distance that it goes into, and then it punctures out.
And can we maybe see a close-up of that tool?
Yep. Yep. Let me change. So that's what the probe would look like. It's a ball probe. I don't know if that's, let me move it away a little bit and put it again, something like that. So that would come down, and I'm just going to cut the sausage as if it is a piece of Cerini.
And while you're setting this up here, we have a question regarding, which parameters might people be most sensitive to, right? Are there certain parameters where people might notice more than other parameters that something might be off?
So people are really good, as I said, at crispness. And crispness also works, but the things are mushy. Imagine you get a burger and it's mushy in the middle, and you didn't want it to be mushy in the middle. You know that, and you feel that right away. Right? So that's very high parameter. Whether something is very resilient or highly cohesive, so it does not fall apart. And so you're chewing it, and you're chewing it, and you're chewing it, and you're chewing it, and the damn thing doesn't break down. That's a problem. And very highly, people are very allergic to that. I know I just had that all broke because I showed it to you all. Oh, there we go, it slid on your machine. Felt like Mr. Rogers there for a moment. Just, okay, please stay with me. So that would be the classic configuration of a Cerini test. And I'm just going to use this corner of the graph here. I think you can see that. Yep. So in a classic Cerini test, that's what the graph looks like. It's basically an upward sloping graph. And when you break through the gel, so the gel is going to deflect down and stretch down until it breaks. That's the break point. The Japanese rating industry uses the force that broke at and the distance that it broke at And gel strength for Cerini, or Cerini strength, is the force times the distance. And so it means that the industry doesn't care if they have a 10% softer gel, if they have a 10% more elongation. Because they'll be able to pay and sell the gel for the same amount. The users might care about the elongation for how they're using it in a certain Cerini application. So it might be good for some type of sushi, but not some other type of sushi. So, so the users might care, but the actual price that they sell the Cerini for is going to be a function of the force times the distance. And it's really the only case where there is an industry standard for what a number should be. In order to be a certain grade Cerini, the force distance Cerini strength has to be a particular thing. So let me jump to screen sharing now. And let me just program this. I'm just trying to make, once again, avoid the tools here. Yeah, it's not gonna work. TA settings. I'm going to go 20 millimeters in, go 3 millimeters a second. The post-test speed doesn't matter. And 5 gram is a good trigger. So, okay. TA, run a test. Fake Cerini. I'm assuming I have this. So I very clearly broke into it. Let me change the colors to make it clear. So this force here, if this was Cerini, the gel would have broken at 630.9 grams, and it broke at 6.097 millimeters. So that there is the point of interest if it was Cerini. The rest of it wouldn't have been mattered, and you probably even would have programmed it to not even capture. Once it detected the break, the instrument would have stopped. When you're on a Cerini boat, some people will actually flip this thing around and do another test on the back side of the Cerini. Absolutely crazy. And the reason they do that is because the elongation distance is going to be a little bit longer, typically. And the grade of Cerini will be a little bit higher. So they will do that on a Cerini boat until they're told not to, because you can sell that, the average values of all of those much better. They also prepare at a lot less sample. So different Cerini boats have different standards as to whether or not that's allowed or not. And that's usually driven by the customers in Japan who are buying the Cerini and allowing the grading system to happen. But that's it. So Cerini gels are one of the few instances where there's both a method and there's a good bad standard. The other instances where there are a method is where they want suppliers and vendors to be buying and selling off the same product, but it's up to the vendors to say, I want a range of 100 to 150. I'm sorry, it's up to the buyers to say, I want a target behavior, but there's no industry standard as to what it is when it comes to textural measurements.
Great. So I've just been notified that we have come over time now, but this is definitely fascinating. Will you be keeping this demo up for another day, perhaps, for others that might be interested in learning more and maybe doing some more one-on-one sessions or anything like that?
Absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll move this out of my kitchen and I'll move it back up to my office. And so I won't have the same lovely background to the demo, but I will have all of the equipment and the software and everything set up for screen sharing. So I'm more than happy to do any tests over the next day or two.
Excellent. Thank you so much.